Hey everybody, this is J.R. Martin, and this is going to be part two of our steampunk themes video. So last week we went on ahead and talked about just in general some of the themes that you encounter in steampunk. This week we're going to be going over that a little bit more, talking more about what you'll actually see as far as steampunk themes, and then not only what you'll see as a reader, but what themes actually work best for steampunk. You as a writer try to come up with ideas like, okay, when I'm writing this, what are going to be some of the things that I should address in this story? One of the key takeaways I want to make sure that I talk about here is that I do fully understand that a lot of times themes are organic. There's a lot of books that talk about that. But basically, your themes appear organically as you write your story. So if you go in with a theme in mind that you're trying to do, it could potentially come out very heavy-handed, and that's something that you may not want to do. So keep that in mind when we're talking about themes. Themes are something that happen organically, but you need to be able to understand the themes that work best within the story so you can know whether or not you have a good story. That's number one. You also have to make sure that the theme fits with what the genre does, right? You shouldn't be writing specifically maybe certain themes about religion in a pure steampunk story, right? There's certain things that you would want to have in that story and certain things that a story lends itself to. There are ways of making other types of stories work, but the ones that it actually works best with it, or better, the one that the story kind of lends itself to naturally, are the ones that I'm going to be talking about and the ones that we have already spoken about. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about Victorian steampunk. So there's Victorian steampunk, and then there's Western steampunk, and then there's also other types of steampunk. I'm breaking them down into Victorian and Western because I've read a lot of Victorian steampunk. I write Western steampunk. So just quick shout out. This is my book, The Engineer's Apprentice. Came out in 2023, takes place in the 1800s. Iso Obasi is a master engineer, and when his apprentice, Annie Saptavong, is, he takes on an apprentice, Annie Saptavong, and together they have to stop their technology from being used to destroy the city of Dallas, Texas. Once again, that's The Engineer's Apprentice, and that's my book. I do a lot of shows, so I go to places like Essence, Comic-Con, just you name it, we've been there. In fact, I will do a separate video right after this talking about that. So first off, we're going to go ahead and talk about Victorian steampunk. So I kind of gave you the opening and everything that we're going to be talking about so far. Now, the question that you may be having is, why Victorian England? It was a time of unimaginable wealth and abject poverty living side by side. It was an age of rigid social rules, but also a time of serial killers, occultism, and revolution. It was an era of scientific reason and logic, but also spiritualism and seances. So what do I mean by all that? So right beside Jack the Ripper in London, you had global expansion by the British Empire, right? At the same time, you have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that is some could say, a mixture of science fiction and, well, it's definitely horror, but it's a mix of science fiction with a little bit of religion and occultism, right? Because what's happening in there, you're bringing the dead back to life. And this is a time period where science thought that the cure for death was just around the corner, right? So you're creating a story that uses these elements as a backdrop. And I think that's super important when you're talking about steampunk, right? Number one, you got to understand that theme comes partly from the world that the characters live in, the world that they operate in. Remember, when you're in situations where you have characters trying to overcome obstacles, those obstacles are built within the environments that the people live in, right? So when you don't fully understand the environment that you're building for your characters can seem somewhat out of place. Now, unless you're writing a fish out of water story and that's your purpose to make the character feel out of place, that's not what you want to do potentially. you have to remember that this time period was the single most punk ready setting in history. I define the punk stories, and when I say punk stories, I'm talking about your cyberpunks, your diesel punks, your solar punks, your steampunks. For me, punk is one of those things that is, it means that the characters have attitude. And when your characters have attitude, that's important for any kind of punk. I swear to God, punk should almost be its own genre, right? Because you have so many different things that are punk. Get cyberpunk, diesel punk, solar punk, steampunk, blah blah punk, right? There's some things that people say, oh man, I was writing some powder punk, and I was like, I'm sorry, what is that? Gunpowder punk. I'm like, didn't know that was a thing, but thank you for calling me in. All of those things exist, but they come from a situation where characters are basically have a little bit of an attitude or a chip on their shoulder about the things that they're dealing with. Steampunk loves these contradictions. It takes them, straps a steam engine to them, and watches the explosion. The themes of Victorian steampunk aren't new. They are the core themes from part one, transformed by this specific intense setting. So the idea is that, once again, your setting really does dictate what happens within these stories. The most important Victorian theme is the social machine, or upstairs versus downstairs. So whenever you're talking about steampunk, whenever you're talking about any of the punk stories, one of those themes that you're going to be dealing with is somebody is always above the person that has the attitude. Now, either you have a goody two shoes that's trying to maintain the status quo, which I'll talk about a little bit more here in a second, who's trying to maintain the status quo, and so trying to maintain order within the steampunk world. If you have a person who is trying to maintain order in the steampunk world, their antagonist is probably going to be the one that puts the punk in steampunk. Their antagonist is going to be a little bit below them, trying to rise up, and they're being, in a weird way, stamped back down, right? On the flip side of that, my personal preference, I like the stories where you have the person trying to overcome the person above, basically downstairs trying to get onto the same plane as upstairs, or, be over upstairs. And what do I mean by that? Well, basically, imagine, if you would, you're a worker, right? You're a worker in this world, and your boss is making you do 70, 80 hours a week. Happens today, happened back then. But back then it was all manual labor. So you aren't seeing your family because you're basically coming home, you're leaving before the sun rises, coming home after the sun sets, eating some food and going to sleep. And that's basically your day. There's no living, there's just existing and making money. Getting ahead isn't really an option. So when I say punk, I'm always talking about that person who is just basically on that downstairs level. In Victorian London, your social class was a cage, and it was almost impossible to escape, as I was just stating. So that's where you get the punk and steampunk. The progress we talked about in part one, here it's not for everyone. Previously, you could make progress. Now it's not for everybody. The rich get clockwork hearts that let them live for 200 years. The poor get steam-powered arms so they can work 20-hour shifts in the factory without collapsing. It's not the same for everyone. You have got to remember that when you're talking about steampunk versus any other type of story or any other type of alternate history story, right? If you're telling a pure alternate history, it doesn't necessarily have to be steampunk. Alternate history stories can tell a lot of different histories. You can examine a lot of different things from the past with a new lens on it. It doesn't have to be steampunk. Steampunk is just a specific genre with specific themes that has a little sci-fi bent to it. The core question of Victorian steampunk is, who benefits from this progress and who gets crushed by its gears? Does that make sense? Your setting must show this divide. Don't just have high society heroes. If you do, show us the cost of their luxury. Who made their beautiful gadgets? Who digs the coal for their airships? Better yet, make your protagonist a rebel from the downstairs, an urchin, a factory worker, a chimney sweep who uses stolen or scavenged technology to fight the system. This is the essence of the punk rebellion. So I hope that makes sense, because that's basically what I was talking about, right? Or basically what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, I'm going through notes here at the same time, so some of this stuff may be repeated, but the point I'm trying to make here is you have two different types of stories that you can tell. And we're about to go through those two different types of stories. One is about order, one is about chaos. I'm going to talk a little bit about the engineer's apprentice once we start talking more about the chaos. But in the Victorian era was obsessed with logic. That's why you have the key logician, the person that represents logic most in steampunks, would be the detective. And the reason for that is detectives represent order. They are law and order. They are the lawful good characters that are there to promote everybody doing their best. It's a natural fit for the mystery genre. Your detective isn't just smart, they have gadgets, a clockwork magnifying glass that analyzes chemical compounds, a logic engine that computes probabilities. They are the agent of order using technology to cut through the chaos. That's what I mentioned before. A lot of times when you're writing these steampunk stories and they're steampunk mysteries or they're steampunk, you name it, if you're on the side of order, your protagonist is typically going to be, and that's going to be the theme, right? Your theme of that story is in part maintaining the status quo, not letting anybody disrupt that. If that's the case, and you're not wanting to write some sort of hidden dystopian story, you got to make sure that that status quo is worth it, that there is something that makes life better for everybody. But here's the deal. If you have a detective who's basically trying to suppress people from the downstairs, trying to rise up and, have that punk rebellion, that theme comes off a little bit differently in your story, right? Because think about it. You're a detective. Let's say Sherlock Holmes was stopping a legitimate rebellion, trying to rise up and overthrow something, right? Overthrow the queen, some man who's trying to bring down his company from the inside, whatever the case may be, and Sherlock Holmes is there one step ahead of him stopping that. In that instance, Sherlock Holmes, even though he may be doing what's legal and right, is kind of being oppressive, right? So you have to understand what type of story you're telling. Are the people that are in the downstairs and you have this order that they're trying to maintain, are those people in the right? Is there, even if there's a grain of truth, are they going about it so wrong that it can't be accepted in the way that they're doing it? And does the hero see ways where things are improving, but it's taking time? You got to make sure that your themes are reflecting that. On the flip side of that, you have chaos. So this is where you have conspiracies. Beneath the civilized surface of society, something sinister is ticking. A secret society of industrialists pulling the strings and mad scientists experimenting on the poor. A cabal of aristocrats using occult rituals and technology to gain power. So what this means is that on the flip side of everything that is good, you have conspiracies. And sometimes when you have these secret societies and everything else that are the order, you need a little bit of chaos. You have to throw a little monkey wrench into the into the works to make some new things happen. And that's the key difference between what you normally see with some steampunk. Is a lot of steampunk is taken from this positive, very orderly world, versus the steampunk, the engineer's apprentice that I'm writing, comes from a more chaotic world. So Iso Obasi is a lawful person. He's a detective, but he also loves chaos. So it's weird, because if you were thinking D&D terms, you would probably say he's like neutral good. He can be a little chaotic. He can be a little lawful. I wish there was a way to say that he was lawful chaotic. That would be amazing, because that makes more sense, right? He wants to create order. He's a logical person. That's his personality. But on the flip side, sometimes the only way to create the order that is beneficial for everybody is to create a little bit of chaos. And so what Issa does, and as an engineer, think about this, He creates order from the chaotic things swirling around him. Same thing with Annie. She can turn something raw and chaotic into something uniform. So I think when I say that they dwell within chaos, or they like starting with chaos to bring something new, that's what I mean when it comes to these two characters. That's why they're very chaotic, but also still orderly or lawful. Why? Because they are used to turning chaotic things, chaotic processes, chaotic systems into something neat and orderly for use by people. That is their job. That is the definition of who they are. So I wish there was something that you could say like, oh, this person is lawful chaotic, but that's not a real thing in D&D, right? You're good and evil, chaotic and lawful. At best, they would be a neutral good, but I don't think that really explains the full extent of their characters. So as a quick tip, one of the big things that you need to remember, use the atmosphere of your city, the smog, the fog, the gaslight. These aren't just window dressings. They are tools for suspense. Ask, what secret is my city hiding? Who really holds the power, and what impossible steam-powered thing are they building in secret? You've got to keep that in mind. You've got to think about that, because your city, your world is part of the atmosphere. Your characters live in this world. Are they in a world of order and detectives that are trying to save the day? Or are they in a world where it's orderly, but there's conspiracies and cabals trying to suppress the people with occultism and everything else, and you're actually having to, your characters are going to be the punk characters putting that punk rebellion together, trying to have that attitude. I personally like writing from the perspective of the underdog. So that's why I write my characters to be underdogs. They're underdogs. They're trying to rise up. They're going to do their best with the skill sets that they have. That is the point. And that's why when I'm writing steampunk, I'm not writing about the punk that is attacking the order, the positive order. I'm actually writing about the punk that is trying to bring down the negative order. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions or comments, just let me know below. Finally, we have the darkest Victorian theme, the Imperial Machine, or the cost of adventure. So I mentioned before that steampunk is definitely, at its heart, it's very much an adventure story. That's what it's here for. That's what steampunk is. It is an adventure story. The British Empire saw itself as a civilizing force, bringing its culture and technology to the unenlightened, basically going on adventures and spreading the good news to all the corners of the world. In steampunk, this is literal. They don't just have an empire, they have a technologically superior one. They have the airships, the landwalkers, and the steam-powered armies to enforce their will. Remember, this is the darkest theme that you can have, is that oppressive society. Once again, it's a step below the cabals, because cabals are still small. But when the entire Victorian era steampunk, whether it's actual London or some stand-in for London in an alternate world where they still have steampunk and it's very similar with similar monarchies and everything else, cool, that's great. But you need to remember that this is like the darkest timeline. So if you're in a world where everybody is being oppressed by the steampunk empire, what type of story are you going to write? Think about that. What type of story are you going to write? And one of the best stories that you could potentially write is one where you're writing it from the perspective not of somebody who's growing up in the empire, but somebody who's growing up in one of these areas that's being colonized, right? The adventure is no longer a simple quest of discovery at these instances. It's an invasion. It's a story of colonialism, of resource extraction, and of cultural clashes when we start talking about those things. So remember, this is a fantastic theme to subvert. Don't write the story from the explorer's perspective. Write it from the perspective of the person being discovered. Literally just said it, but it sounds nice, so I'll say it twice. Write about the resistance. Show us a Zulu warrior or an Indian artisan learning to reverse engineer the empire's technology and use it against them. This is how you take a 19th century genre and make it speak to a 21st century audience. There are some people who are going to enjoy reading the book the way, reading steampunk from, when they were steampunk first, I think the 1980s, right, was introduced. And there's people who like those types of stories. But make sure you do your best to modernize and make it for today's audience. So Victorian steampunk takes our core engine and wraps it in a world of rigid class, thick fog, and global ambition. It asks us to look under the polished brass and see the ugly truth of the social machine. I mean, this is the Victorian times in England, and whether it's somewhere else in France or Germany or what have you, the Victorian times were definitely more rigid, more structured, different from how things were in the United States, where we were a little bit looser and wilder, a little bit more rugged. Hint, hint, Wild Wild West. Um, it's a powerful and critical, fantastic genre. Honestly, it's one that I really love, and I truly do enjoy writing in because of all those interesting tidbits that you have within steampunk. So, as I was saying, hint, hint, London isn't the only place where you can see steampunk. We're going to be talking about the Wild Wild West next time. And when I say the Wild Wild West, I'm not just talking about the West, but we're going to talk about what things were like in steampunk in the United States, move more towards the West, and then that'll be the final bit that we talk about as far as the steampunk and its themes. But I want to make sure that we all understand that steampunk themes are here and they're amazing, but that this is what they lean themselves to, right? Steampunk, when you get down to it, is really a compare and contrast. It's a compare and contrast between the upstairs and downstairs, between the haves and have-nots, between those who are being oppressed and those who are not oppressed, but not oppressed in what we would normally think of as oppression. We're talking about oligarchies being in control of people who have steam-powered arms, right? Remember what I said before? Those steam-powered arms are there to make sure that the workers can do more with less people for longer periods of time. On the flip side of that, some steampunk, like in my story here, you're building automaton bodies for the rich that allows them to live forever with superhuman strength, agility, and everything else. How is it being used? Compare and contrast. Don't be afraid to lean into that. There's going to be some other natural themes, your characters and who they are, understanding the environment that they're growing up in, understanding the rules of your world. One of the things I'd like to mention is I'm from El Paso, Texas. There's not a lot of grass that grows in El Paso, Texas. So when you are, well, not from, but I've lived in El Paso. So when you're in El Paso, Texas, a lot of the homes, there's a few that have grass, but the majority of homes have rocks. They also have stone fences, right? On the flip side, you come to Dallas. Dallas does not have a lot of stone fences. There are people who have them, but most people have like wooden fences or wrought iron fences here in Dallas. And that's what's interesting. If you see a person with a wooden fence in El Paso, that person is usually pretty wealthy, or, because the cost of getting wood to do those fences is astronomical. Cost of getting stone from the quarries to be able to do the stone fences here in Dallas is astronomical. You've got to remember those things, right? Your world, the atmosphere, everything in it determines how the characters behave and who the characters are going to be. So don't put Luke Skywalker in the middle of the Lord of the Rings. It's not going to happen. It's not going to work. That's not who Luke Skywalker is, right? You have got to make sure that anything that you do in that story, as far as building the atmosphere, building the world, it actually informs on the story for the reader. And you as readers, hopefully this makes sense why some of these characters may feel off to you when you read a book and you're like, hey, the world was cool, but the character just didn't seem like he was the right fit for it. This is why, because sometimes in those instances, the person that designed this world, now they have a plot that they want to run through, but the plot doesn't actually fit the world, right? It doesn't fit the world to the point and the extent that they actually wanted to. And so they have characters doing things that they wouldn't be doing, because why would I try to grow grass or raise a bunch of fruits and vegetables in El Paso, Texas? I'm not saying it can't be done, but imagine the level of effort. What is a stereotypical person going to do? They may have a little small greenhouse. They may have one or two things that they can easily take care of, a few herbs. But then we're talking about El Paso, Texas. It is hot, right? It's like, why would I wear, a swimsuit when it's -20 outside? That's kind of crazy. Are there people that do it? Apparently so. But the whole point is you got to make sure that your characters actually fit the world that they're in. One, make sure the characters fit the world, and then make sure that those themes and everything else line up. Okay, and that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this segment of the steampunk themes, and we will actually be talking about the Wild West next time. Have a great day.